Emma was just 12 years old when her world changed forever. Her father, Daniel, had always been her hero. He was the one who made her laugh when she was sad, told her bedtime stories, and promised her that he would always be there for her. But now he was gone. Just like that. No warnings, no goodbyes, just an empty space where he used to be. The day of the funeral was cold and gray, as if the sky itself was mourning with her. People filled the room, dressed in black, whispering to each other in hushed voices. Some were crying, some were comforting one another, but Emma could hear nothing except the sound of her own heart pounding. She sat in the front row with her mother, staring at the wooden coffin that held the man who had once been so full of life. It didn't seem real. It didn't seem fair. She wanted to believe this was all a terrible dream, and that she would wake up any moment to find her father sitting in the kitchen, sipping his coffee, smiling at her like he always did. But no matter how hard she wished, the nightmare didn't end. When it was time for the final goodbye, Emma felt frozen. People stepped forward one by one, placing flowers beside the coffin, whispering their farewells. She watched as her mother stood over him, her hands trembling as she touched his face one last time. Emma's chest tightened. She didn't want to say goodbye. How could she? How could she just walk away and accept that she would never hear his voice again? Her feet moved on their own as she stepped closer. Her hand shook as she reached out, touching his cold fingers. A wave of sorrow crashed over her, and before she knew it, tears streamed down her face. Without thinking, she leaned over and wrapped her arms around him. He felt so still, so lifeless, but she didn't care. "I love you, Daddy," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Please don't leave me." The room grew silent. She didn't know how long she stayed like that, holding him as if she could somehow bring him back with the warmth of her love. People around her shifted uncomfortably, unsure of what to say or do, but Emma couldn't let go. She pressed her cheek against his chest, her small frame trembling with sobs. Her mother gently touched her shoulder, trying to pull her away. "Emma, sweetheart, we have to." Then something happened, something that made the entire room freeze. Emma felt it. A slight movement. A twitch. It was faint, almost unnoticeable, but it was there. Her breath caught in her throat as she pulled back slightly, eyes wide with shock. Had she imagined it? Had her grief played tricks on her? But then it happened again, a tiny flutter beneath her hand. And that was when the whispers in the room turned to gasps. Emma's hands trembled as she stared at her father's still face. Had she really felt something, or was it just her imagination? Her heart pounded so loudly in her chest that she could barely hear the whispers spreading through the room. Her mother frowned, gently pulling her away. "Emma, sweetheart, come here," she said softly, her voice filled with sorrow. But Emma didn't move. Her wide eyes remained locked on her father's hand, which she had been holding just moments ago. She had felt it. She was sure of it. A slight twitch, a tiny movement. She swallowed hard, looking around the room. The people gathered there were watching her with sad, confused expressions. Some shook their heads, thinking it was just the desperation of a grieving child. Others glanced at each other, unsure of what to do. Emma's fingers tightened over her father's hand. What if she was right? What if he wasn't truly gone? She took a deep breath, hoping, praying, and then she whispered, "Daddy." For a moment, nothing happened. The room was painfully quiet, the kind of silence that made her feel like she was standing on the edge of a dream. And then it happened again. A slight movement, a barely noticeable twitch in his fingers. Emma gasped, stumbling backward. "He moved," she cried out, her voice breaking through the heavy silence in the room. At first, no one reacted. The shock held them frozen in place. But then one of the funeral home workers quickly stepped forward. He leaned in, his expression uncertain as he stared at Daniel's hand. A second passed, then another. Then Daniel's fingers moved again. This time, the reaction was instant. Gasps filled the air, and people took hurried steps forward. Some cried out in shock, others covered their mouths in disbelief. The funeral director, an older man with years of experience, paled as he stumbled backward. This can't be," he muttered under his breath. Emma's mother grabbed her daughter, pulling her away from the coffin. Tears streamed down her face, but this time, they weren't just from grief. They were from something else. A tiny, fragile hope. Emma's heart raced as she clung to her mother's arm. She had been right. She hadn't imagined it. Her father, he was moving. A commotion broke out as someone shouted to call an ambulance. The workers rushed forward, checking for any signs of life. One of them pressed his fingers to Daniel's neck, searching for a pulse. His face turned white. I feel something," he stammered. "It's faint, but it's there." A ripple of disbelief spread through the room. People murmured in hushed voices, some too shocked to say anything at all. How was this possible? How could a man declared dead suddenly show signs of life? Emma clutched her mother's hand, tears blurring her vision. She didn't know what was happening, but she knew one thing for certain. This was not the end. Something amazing was about to begin. The room was in chaos. Some people gasped in shock, others whispered in disbelief, and a few even took steps back, unsure of what they were witnessing. Emma stood frozen, her small hands clenching tightly into fists as she stared at her father's hand. It had moved again. There was no doubt about it. The funeral director, still pale, turned to the staff. "Call an ambulance. Right now," he ordered, his voice shaking. Emma's mother, still holding her tightly, let out a trembling breath. She didn't know whether to cry, scream, or collapse. Just moments ago, she had been saying goodbye to her husband, believing she would never see him again. And now there was a chance. A small, impossible chance that he was still here. One of the paramedics who had been attending the funeral rushed forward, pushing through the stunned crowd. He quickly leaned over the coffin, his hands shaking as he checked for signs of life. He pressed 2 fingers against Daniel's neck, waiting. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. Then, after what felt like forever, the paramedic's eyes widened. "I can feel something," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's weak, but there's a pulse." A wave of gasps filled the room. Emma felt her mother's grip tighten around her, and she could hear the sharp intake of breath beside her. People who had been standing still just moments ago now moved closer, their faces filled with shock and disbelief. The paramedic acted fast. "We need to get him out of here now," he shouted to the staff. "Help me lift him." 2 workers rushed forward, carefully reaching into the coffin. Emma watched, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst. They gently lifted her father's body and placed him onto a stretcher that had been wheeled in by another medic. Emma felt like she was trapped in a dream. Just a few minutes ago, she had believed her father was gone forever. Now, he was being rushed out of his own funeral, his body still showing signs of life. She couldn't move. She could barely breathe. Her mother grabbed her shoulders, kneeling in front of her. "Emma, listen to me," she said, her voice filled with urgency. "We need to go to the hospital. We need to be there with him." Emma blinked, snapping out of her daze. She nodded quickly. "Yes, let's go." Without wasting another second, they rushed outside. The paramedics had already loaded her father into the ambulance, and one of them waved them over. "Get in," he called. Emma and her mother climbed inside, sitting near her father's still form. His face was pale, his body unmoving, but now there was hope. Hope that they never thought they'd have again. The sirens wailed as the ambulance sped toward the hospital. Emma held her mother's hand tightly, praying with all her heart. She didn't know what would happen next, but she knew one thing for sure. This wasn't over. Not yet. The ambulance raced through the streets, its sirens wailing loudly. Emma sat beside her mother, gripping her hand tightly. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest, her breath coming in short, shaky gasps. Her father lay on the stretcher in front of her, still unconscious, but the beeping of the monitor beside him gave her hope. He was alive. His heartbeat was weak, but it was there. The paramedic sitting next to her father checked his vitals again. His pulse is still faint, but stable, he said, glancing at Emma's mother. We'll be at the hospital in a few minutes. The doctors will take over from there. Emma couldn't take her eyes off her father's face. Just hours ago, she had believed she would never see him again. She had thought he was gone forever. But now, here he was, fighting, holding on. A part of her wanted to believe it was because of her, because she had refused to let go. Her mother wiped a tear from her cheek and took a deep breath. "How is this possible?" she whispered. "They said he was gone. The doctors declared him dead." The paramedic hesitated before answering. "Sometimes rare cases happen," he explained. "There's a condition called catalepsy. It can make a person appear lifeless, with no movement or response. Even their heartbeat can slow down so much that it's hard to detect. It doesn't happen often, but it's possible." Emma's eyes widened. "So, Daddy was never really gone?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The paramedic gave her a small, reassuring smile. "It looks like he was in a deep, unresponsive state. But whatever happened back there, when you held him, when you called out to him, something changed. Maybe your love reached him in a way we don't fully understand." Tears welled up in Emma's eyes. But this time, they weren't just from sadness. They were from hope. The ambulance finally pulled up in front of the hospital, and the back doors swung open. A team of doctors and nurses were already waiting. They rushed forward, carefully unloading her father and wheeling him inside. Emma and her mother hurried after them, their legs moving as fast as they could. Inside the hospital, everything was a blur. Nurses moved quickly, doctors spoke in hurried voices, and machines beeped all around them. Emma clutched her mother's hand, feeling overwhelmed by everything happening around her. A doctor turned to them. "We'll do everything we can," he assured them. "Please wait here." Emma and her mother watched as the doors swung shut behind her father's stretcher. And then, silence. Emma took a deep breath, trying to calm herself. She looked up at her mother, who was wiping away more tears. "He's going to be okay, right?" Emma asked, her voice small but full of hope. Her mother wrapped an arm around her and held her close. "I don't know, sweetheart," she whispered, "but we have hope. And sometimes, hope is enough." Emma and her mother sat in the hospital waiting area, their hands tightly clasped together. The white walls, the soft hum of machines, and the quiet whispers of nurses moving through the halls made everything feel surreal. Time seemed to stretch endlessly as they waited for news. Emma's mind was filled with memories of her father, his warm smile, his laughter, the way he would spin her around in the living room while music played. She couldn't accept a world without him. He had to wake up. He just had to. Her mother let out a shaky breath. "I still can't believe this is happening," she whispered. "One moment, we were mourning him. And now we're hoping he'll open his eyes." Emma nodded slowly. "I knew he wasn't gone," she said softly. "I felt it." Just then, the sound of footsteps made them look up. A doctor in a white coat approached them, his expression serious yet calm. Emma and her mother stood up immediately, their hearts pounding. The doctor cleared his throat before speaking. "Daniel is still unconscious, but his vitals are improving," he said. "It's truly remarkable. When he arrived, his pulse was weak, but now, it's growing stronger." Emma's mother covered her mouth with her hands, her eyes brimming with tears. "Does that mean he's going to wake up?" she asked, her voice filled with both fear and hope. The doctor hesitated for a moment. "We can't say for sure," he admitted. "His body went through something very unusual. It might take time, but the fact that he's responding is a very good sign." Emma felt a lump form in her throat. "Can I see him?" she asked. The doctor nodded. "Only for a little while," he said. "Come with me." Emma and her mother followed the doctor down the hallway, their hearts racing with every step. When they finally reached the room, Emma hesitated for a moment before stepping inside. Her father lay in the hospital bed, covered with a thin white blanket. Wires were attached to machines that beeped steadily, monitoring his condition. His chest rose and fell slowly, proof that he was still here, still fighting. Emma walked over to his bedside and gently took his hand. It was warm now, not cold like before. A tiny flicker of hope lit up inside her. "Daddy," she whispered, "I know you can hear me. Please wake up." Her mother stood behind her, wiping away silent tears. The room was quiet except for the soft beeping of the monitors. Emma didn't know how long she stood there, holding her father's hand, but she refused to let go. Then, just as she was about to speak again, something happened. A slight movement. A twitch in his fingers. Emma gasped, her eyes widening. "Mom." He moved. She cried out. Her mother rushed forward, staring in disbelief. And then, slowly, Daniel's eyelids fluttered. Emma's breath caught in her throat as she watched her father's eyelids flutter. It was only for a second, but she had seen it. He was trying to wake up. "Mom, did you see that?" she whispered, gripping her father's hand even tighter. Her mother nodded, covering her mouth as tears streamed down her face. "I saw it," she choked out. "Oh my God, he's trying to come back." Emma leaned closer, her heart racing. "Daddy, it's me, Emma. Can you hear me?" she said softly. For a moment, there was silence. The steady beeping of the heart monitor was the only sound in the room. Then her father's fingers twitched again, slightly squeezing Emma's hand. A small, weak movement, but enough to make her heart soar. Emma let out a sob of happiness. "Mom, he's responding." Her mother rushed to the other side of the bed, gently touching Daniel's face. "Daniel, sweetheart, if you can hear us, try to wake up," she pleaded. Emma could feel the tension in the air. The doctor had said it might take time, but her father was trying. He was fighting. A few seconds later, a quiet sound escaped his lips, a faint, almost inaudible sigh. Then his eyelids fluttered again, this time opening slightly. His gaze was unfocused, his eyes heavy, but they were open. Tears rolled down Emma's cheeks. "Daddy, you're awake." Daniel's lips parted slightly, and a raspy breath escaped. He blinked slowly, his eyes moving between Emma and her mother, as if trying to recognize them. A nurse who had been standing nearby quickly rushed out of the room to call the doctor. Moments later, the doctor entered, his face a mix of shock and amazement. "This is incredible," he said, stepping closer to check Daniel's vitals. "He's coming back faster than we expected." Emma's mother let out a soft sob, stroking her husband's forehead. "You scared us so much," she whispered. "We thought we lost you." Daniel swallowed with difficulty, his voice barely above a whisper. I heard you," he murmured weakly. Emma gasped. "You did." He gave the smallest nod, his tired eyes looking at her. "I heard your voice. I felt your hand. I tried to come back." Emma's heart swelled with emotion. She had been right. He had heard her. Her love had reached him even when he was lost in the darkness. The doctor smiled warmly. "He needs rest, but this is a miracle. He's back." Emma didn't let go of his hand. She didn't care how long it would take for him to fully recover. What mattered was that he was here, with her, alive. As she sat by his side, she whispered, "I told you I wouldn't say goodbye." Daniel lay in the hospital bed, his eyes half open, still weak but awake. Emma couldn't stop looking at him, afraid that if she blinked, this moment would disappear like a dream. But it wasn't a dream. Her father was alive. Her mother wiped her tears and smiled through her sobs. "You don't know how much we prayed for this," she whispered, gently squeezing Daniel's hand. Daniel's lips curled into the faintest smile. His voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. "I never left," he murmured. "I could hear you. I wanted to come back." Emma's heart swelled with emotion. "I knew it. I knew you could hear me," she said, her voice trembling with joy. I kept talking to you, hoping you'd come back." Daniel's tired eyes softened as he looked at his daughter. "You saved me, sweetheart," he said slowly, his words broken but full of meaning. "Your voice, your touch, pulled me back." The doctor stepped closer, checking Daniel's vitals again. He smiled in amazement. "Your recovery is truly remarkable," he said. "You were unresponsive for hours, yet your body is stabilizing faster than we expected." Daniel gave a weak chuckle. "I guess I wasn't ready to leave yet," he whispered. Emma laughed softly, wiping her eyes. "And I wasn't ready to let you go." The doctor patted Daniel's shoulder. "You still need plenty of rest, but your progress is nothing short of a miracle. We'll continue to monitor you, but I believe you'll make a full recovery." Daniel nodded slightly, his eyes growing heavier again. He was still exhausted, his body weak, but there was life in him now, life that hadn't been there before. Emma and her mother stayed by his side, refusing to leave. As the hours passed, Daniel drifted in and out of sleep, but every time he woke up, he would look at Emma and smile. It was as if he wanted to reassure her that he was really there, that he wasn't going anywhere. Family members and close friends arrived one by one, shocked and overjoyed to see Daniel alive. Some cried, some hugged Emma and her mother, and others simply sat in disbelief, still struggling to understand how this had happened. "I have never heard of anything like this," one of their relatives whispered. "This is truly a miracle." Emma agreed. It was a miracle, a second chance that they never expected to have. That night, as Daniel drifted off to sleep again, Emma held his hand, just as she had in the funeral home. But this time, instead of saying goodbye, she whispered, "Good night, Daddy. I'll be here when you wake up." And for the first time in what felt like forever, she truly believed that everything was going to be okay.